Welcome to Pod of Jake, a podcast hosted by Jake. You can go to zerofjake.com to learn more about Jake and everything that he does, and feel free to email him anytime at jake@blogofjake.com or message him at zerofjake on Twitter or at Jake on Warpcast. Anyway, we thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy this episode. If you do, please consider giving Pod of Jake a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support.
Thank you, Mel, for taking the time and joining me on the podcast today. I appreciate you taking the time. You're working on a very interesting project. Let's see if I can pronounce it right. Theopetra Labs, or the name of the project is really Theopetra. I think the company is Theopetra Labs. I'm going to stumble over that at least a couple of times over the course of this podcast, I'm sure. But you've got an interesting story and it's a very interesting project. So I think the best way to start would be to tell your story a little bit from as early as you're willing to start to where you are today, and talk about some of the decisions you made along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Happy to kind of give some background and context here. I was originally born in Europe, in former Yugoslavia at that time, and it was right during the Civil War in the 90s. And my dad was a commander there at the time. The opposing army, when I was around 2, they ended up finding our home, and they lit our home on fire while my mom and I were still in the home, and they ended up letting us flee. We grabbed my grandma and we fled for a few days throughout the woods. We ended up making it to Germany, and I think Bill Clinton was the president at the time, and they took in the refugees, and that was kind of like our introduction to the United States. I was around 3 at the time at that point. And just had the standard kind of refugee immigrant, upbringing where, we grew up in a family with 10 to 12 people in a home, food stamps. My entire family is always entrepreneurial. So we've always just kind of hustled, just kind of had a standard, middle class, lifestyle, I guess you could say. And that kind of built, I guess you could say, the foundation of the entrepreneurship in my blood, I guess you could say. My first company, I was around 19. I started a nutritional supplement company with a doctor. We ended up moving out to California. It was just me and him. We came out to California together. I was just turning 20 at the time, and that thing just took off. I think Instagram, that was around 2014. Came out of here to California, and that was kind of like my first business. It ended up taking off because of Instagram's taken off, influencer marketing did well. I ended up selling that company, and that was kind of like my first taste of, I guess you could say, like a cash infusion, and I was hooked on entrepreneurship from there. And after the sale of that company, I transitioned into real estate. That was my first intro to real estate. Bought a couple of properties. I saw what the agent was doing at that time, and I saw he didn't really do that much work, so I transitioned into real estate there because I was like, he doesn't do much. I can do that. And since then, I closed about $100 million in residential sales here in Southern California. So that's been kind of the bulk of my professional career. I ended up discovering Bitcoin around 2016. 2015 was my first intro. 2016 was kind of my deep dive, and just like everyone else, my first thought was, this is a scam, nonsense, dismissed it, right? It did a little bit of a run up, revisited it, and I was just mind blown. I was mind blown by the concept. I was mind blown by the industry and its pace. And I told myself, when it comes down, I'm going to go all in. And I think it was like 2018, during that big kind of, the beginning of the bear market is when I decided to go all in on the industry. And and that was kind of my first intro, I guess you could say, to crypto at that point, was 2018.
So what did going all in like entail for you? Was that just the financial investment? Did you know that you kind of wanted to build something in or around crypto? What was like going all in? What did that mean for you?
Yeah, for me, I feel like I learn the best when I'm all in. So I all in as in 100% of net worth. I just sold all the assets I had, and I kind of just forced myself into learning this ecosystem. Lost a ton of cash. Just got absolutely wrecked, right? Did well in a couple of things, and that was kind of my intro to learning the space.
And
And
just Bitcoin or all sorts of crypto?
it started off with Bitcoin. It was kind of the same rabbit hole as everyone else, right? You start off with Bitcoin, you go into ETH, and then you kind of venture down alts, the alt rabbit hole, and that's where you get kind of wrecked.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. Well, so presumably, you still held on to a lot of the Bitcoin and the Ethereum and everything, and you've been kind of all in ever since. Were you at that time already thinking about building something in the space, or just looking at it as like financial investment at that time?
Yeah, so at that time, my thesis was after I went down the alt rabbit hole, I reverted back to kind of the core five, Bitcoin, ETH, Chainlink, and I told myself I'm going to just sit on the sidelines. Somebody's going to build a real estate project. Somebody a lot smarter than me is going to build a real estate project, and I have enough expertise in the field where I can underwrite it and I can be early and I can get my glorified 1000x, right? So I just sat and I analyzed real estate projects for about 18 months, and I realized a lot of the same things kept coming out. It was either A, just flat out securities, or B, it was people releasing charts on how big the real estate industry was and just releasing a token that has nothing to do with real estate. So it's kind of like those two segments. And nothing really came out. And that was kind of like the beginning origins of Theopetra at that time, like the beginning inklings.
If there was no project that was standout, super interesting to you, were there elements of various projects that you stumbled upon that were more interesting than others, or anything that you sort of came across where you said like, that's interesting, or pretty uninteresting overall for what you were expecting?
Yeah, the one project that I saw that really accelerated the development timeline of Theo was Olympus. Um, and the reason behind that was their ability to crowdfund and build a incredibly deep community at that time. So I would say Olympus was a big driving force of just the culture that they had at that time, and then also the ability to crowdfund like they did was I guess you could say the main catalyst for us.
Right. And then when did you decide to actually start Theopetra?
Yeah, so it was actually in 2021. I did about 12 months of legal due diligence. And then I just started completely organically on Twitter. I started posting the concept of Theopetra just to see if there was any, inkling of interest online. And within about 3 months, I ended up doing over 1,000 calls with potential users. I was just doing calls almost all day, and I was just booking group calls with potential users that entire time just through Twitter. Our team came completely organically through Twitter. All the users came through Twitter, and I wanted to see if there was any sort of demand for something like Theo because real estate's a very long-term outlook. I didn't know if there was going to be a mismatch there.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, we did a bunch of calls. Everybody was interested, and the team kind of came together organically on through that process as well, and that was kind of the beginning origin.
Yeah, it's interesting. 1,000's like a ton of calls, obviously. Like you could do 10 and get like a pretty good idea of, maybe what people have to say about it or what people think, try to get a sense of the pulse. So you could do 100 and you get like, a much better version of that.
Yeah.
1,000 is like that's, 900 incremental calls. What was the like reasoning for, doing so many calls? What was like your intention or objective or goal in like doing all of that, or just the driving reason why you did that? And what came out of all of that? Besides, it sounds like that's how you met the team.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention there too. Right before the Olympus, I read Balaji's article actually on cloud countries, and that kind of shook me to the core. I read it from the real estate lens of how communities can band together, and you kind of create a deeper community because of the tangible assets you own together. Um, that was actually another catalyst. But yeah, the reason behind the 1,000 calls was simply being I was just insecure. I wanted to make sure that people really wanted it. I knew it had to be organic as well. I felt like this was a really good way to bootstrap an organic community. And it was purely just out of being insecure and feeling like I didn't have a place in the industry, just because I'm a real estate guy. I didn't know much about crypto at the time, so it was really just to double, triple, quadruple check, and also build a kind of an organic community at the time too.
Right. So yeah, that all makes sense. And certainly like, having 1,000 calls isn't the easiest way to bootstrap a community, but going that like manual approach one by one certainly, would seem to be an effective way. So are you kind of drawing upon those, 1,000 people that you spoke with to build this initial community now that you've got the project underway?
Yeah, and the a lot of the early members are still with us. We've had an interesting kind of retention just as far as a community that has stuck with us its entire time. And yeah, we pivoted a bunch of times since we started, of course, just like any other project. But yeah, it's been an interesting ride so far. I would say the combination of Balaji's thesis and also just kind of seeing um, other projects flourish was kind of the original beginnings. But yeah, since that launching point back in 2021, um, yeah, we've been just kind of bootstrapping ever since, just through the organic community that we have.
Right. So maybe you can sort of speak to what Theopetra is today, like the current instantiation. It seems to be the one. I mean, you could speak to the prior, pre-pivots and things like
Mhm.
that, but this seems like it struck a bit of a chord thus far. Maybe you could speak to, what exactly it is and how it's going so far.
Yeah, so the thesis for Theo is actually really simple, and it follows Balaji's thesis as well. We first had social networks, which was the first form of human organization that created value, was social networks, things like Facebook, Instagram. Then we had Bitcoin, which was a form of financial organization, which created value. And then the thesis for Theo is really simple, which are is Web3 only going to be just trading tokens back and forth, or are communities actually going to start breaching out into the real world and start buying actual real world assets together? And that's kind of the principle behind Theo. And we took it a slightly step further, which was, how do you create the deepest community that you possibly can? And the basis for Theo is, we crowdfund assets together, we buy housing for the community, and we freeze rents. So we don't increase rents more than 1% a year, and we monetize through other parts of the liquidity stack, to keep the rents as low as we can for the community members. That way, the community can just kind of purely focus on their craft, on whatever that is, right? So it's we buy housing for the community, we freeze the rents, and then that individual can just really pursue their craft of whatever that profession or art might be. Is kind of the basic principle of Theo.
So is there like the ambition is basically to, with most people, you look at their like they have their income and then a large amount of that gets taxed. And then their next biggest sort of expense is their rent or their mortgage or whatever it is. And
Mhm.
am I hearing you correctly that you're kind of trying to eliminate that as such a large piece of the pie where it's, they're still gonna be paying rent, but ideally through this structure, it's somehow pretty low and pretty fixed over a long period of time so that they can not have to worry so much about this major expense, have a much lower burn in life overall, and be able to just kind of work on whatever they want to work on rather than maybe having to do something that pays the bills, but they're not really enjoying.
That's exactly correct, and it's a very simple structure where, if the rent is $1,000, we keep your rent frozen at $1,000. 1% increases over year, and the simple way that you pay rent is you just buy Theo and you burn it yourself. It's tax efficient. It's great for the user. It's great for the project, of course. So we kept the overall tokenomics incredibly simple as well, and that's exactly correct. Freeze rent so that way people can relieve that burden, and they can kind of focus on the things that matter the most.
Right. So people come in, they discover the project, they buy Theo, and then that entitles them to basically be a part of this network and they can pay their rent that way and things like that. It's a little blurry for me maybe there, but basically, what part of that, I guess I'm wondering, enables them to have a lower rent. Like 1% increase in and of itself is super valuable, especially in a inflationary environment or something like that. That's
Mhm.
huge. Almost like, a rent fixed apartment in any, you name your city. It's pretty rare these days, but they do exist. Um, but is there something that is making like the starting price of, $1,000 rent or whatever cheaper than what one might find elsewhere? Or is it just the places you guys are buying property to start are relatively low cost of living places? How can I think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, kind of double clicking on the Theo tokenomics side on how it exactly works. It's a really simple system where the way that you mint Theo, a new Theo into the market is you deposit Ethereum into the treasury. So ETH goes into the treasury, new Theo is being minted. We're going to have a Borg system in place that decides, who are we buying a property for out of the community. So as we crowdfund enough, we ended up buying a property for somebody in the community. And then the way they pay rent, the rent itself will just be subject to whatever local rents are in that area.
Yeah.
So of course the Midwest will be different than the West Coast, or somewhere in like New York, but fairly simple setup where they go in, they rent the property, and then they burn Theo to pay for their rents.
Right. And then so how does that work in comparison with like I understand you guys bought a chunk of land, I think in
Mhm.
Colorado was like the first piece of land. I think it's 5 acres. Um, how do I think about those 5 acres versus it sounds like these rental properties are actually sort of assigned to one individual in the community?
Yeah, so the land deal that we have is so a big part of a network state is we need to have recurring revenue that isn't just rents, because the rental revenue will take some time to bootstrap with an organic community. So what we're doing is we're just buying land and we're subdividing those plots into smaller plots, and we're selling that off for $20 a month. So right now you might have seen on our page where we're doing like a citizenship program. So $19 a month, you get access to land. We also airdrop the token to you as well. So you're kind of like dollar cost averaging, but then you're also paying for land. So yeah, we'll have like a land product, then we'll also have a rental property product as well, depending on what people want.
Right. And it sounded or it looked like from looking through the website and the white paper and everything, you guys have like sort of a third leg, which is like these microspaces, or is that
Mhm.
referring to these small chunks of land, or is that something distinct?
Yeah, so Moby actually is my private development company where right now we're doing a few tests on micro housing. Um, I ended up looking at Japan. I saw that they had a 0.001% homelessness rate, and I was like, how the hell are they doing that? What kind of triggered that? And they had this concept that was they were called internet cafes, and they actually solved their housing crisis completely by accident. They started this concept off with internet cafes, and they were just really tiny spaces, around 30 to 50 square feet, and it was originally just primarily used for just the internet, and they allowed 24/7 access, and it was just a tiny space for you to just go in and use a computer. Users, of course, started hacking that as a form of almost like a pseudo form of housing.
Hmm.
And when I saw that, it kind of clicked in my brain. I was like, they're not selling housing; they're just selling a form of dignity in a way. And we don't really have a product like that in the United States. Um, so just with private capital, we ended up bootstrapping some micro spaces here in California, and it's been a total home run for us on that end. So we're actually raising capital right now to deploy micro spaces in the network as well for users.
And so is that an endeavor that you've pursued separately or previously to Theo, where you've done this microspace? Is that part of like your like regular real estate business that you've been doing, or is it all under the umbrella of Theo?
Yeah, so it's all under the umbrella of Theo. The original concept behind it was I was trying to see how we could bootstrap Theo faster by reducing the unit cost to just crowd fund, get people into the network faster.
Right.
And that was kind of the original need was how do we reduce the cost of a home from 150K down to 20, if we is that even possible? So that was kind of like the original concept behind it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because especially I'm just thinking about the Japan story is really interesting and it's somewhat arbitrary that we have this sort of default expectation of how big a house or an apartment should be. And, you see with like a different example that's somewhat similar to maybe the internet cafes, like, hostels where you travel abroad and,
Yeah.
you don't even get your own room. You just get like a bunk or whatever. And it's like $10 a night or $20 a night or whatever it is. And, all housing at the end of the day, like, especially for, well, it doesn't really matter actually if you're working in an office or you're working remote or whatever, like the primary function of housing really is like having a place to sleep. And then, maybe secondarily, like a place where you can, cook. But if you can get like cheap meals elsewhere, if like the internet cafe serves cheap meals, you don't really need to be able to cook in your unit. You just, have access to reasonably priced food, elsewhere, and the margins between, cheap restaurant food and cooking at your house and buying groceries isn't really very significant. So it's an interesting default, I guess, that you're questioning, and how big do people's places need to be? And on the one hand, you have that as like a solution for homelessness potentially, but that's kind of a hairy beast in the US in terms of like addressing that issue. You've got people who, maybe can afford, like some percentage of homelessness is people genuinely can't afford housing, but another is like, crazy people or drug addicts and whatever else. And giving them a practical solution might not necessarily work. But it's interesting even for people who aren't homeless who are just seeking to minimize their burn, which I think is an increasingly popular thing these days, and relates back to the point that we were making earlier about you guys being able to provide relatively cheap rent so that people can have more financial freedom, basically. If you limit your burn past a certain degree, it doesn't take that much money to have several years of runway to be able to work on whatever you want to work on. So it's definitely an interesting default. Are there other projects, I guess, besides like the or other sort of things that you've seen outside of the Japanese, internet cafes that have given you ideas that this is like a workable thing, especially in the States, or your early experiments with the microspaces in the States? How have those gone?
Yeah, the microspaces from Japan is the primary use that I've seen of. I think to your point, there's this huge expectation in the American markets that the minimum by default is 120 square feet, and that's all users will pay for. When we ended up launching our case study with the 6 micro units that we have, um, to your point, a lot of them were people just reducing their burn. So we have a software developer, we have a guy going through school. A couple of the users downgraded from a room. They were renting a room before, so they downgraded to a rental space, to this micro space. So far, we've had 100%. We've had 0% vacancy, and we've had hundreds of requests per unit essentially as soon as we came online. So I think to your point, I think the market was overestimating how much space people actually need if their only goal is just burn reduction. But Japan is the only example that I've seen pretty much across the world where they've handled their housing crisis immaculately. I mean, um, starting from the culture of how homelessness is treated, down to how they do drug laws, down to their regulation of spaces. If anybody's fascinated by the housing crisis, I think Japan is a shining example for the world.
So, how many units in the microspaces do you have? What's the average cost of those units, and how long have you been doing this? You mentioned 100% occupancy. Have these been available for a year, or, what's the timeline? How many units and what's the price? Oh, and what's the size? So price, size, and number of units.
Yeah, so V1 for this case study, I actually lived in one before we launched it. I wanted to make sure that it was as dialed in as possible. But the V1 is 32 square feet, anywhere between 32 square feet and 38 square feet. So we condensed it as small as we possibly could. They cost around $6,000 to build, and they cash flow right around 2,500 to about 3,000 a year, and net cash flow proceeds. So they've been pretty successful as far as like a small case study on that end.
So let me just check that. So it's 6,000 you said to build per unit, and then
Yep.
2,500 or so cash flow. So 8,500, let's round it to eight or whatever per unit per year. So that's what, a little less than $80 a month,
Yeah, so we charge
or 800,
450 a month.
800, sorry.
We charge 450 a month, between 450 to 600 depending on the sizes. We have some like XLs that are larger, so we charge anywhere between 450 to 600. It's here in Orange County, California. Um,
So
and
it's a desirable spot where the
yeah,
local rents would be really high for a, normal square footage apartment. And so you're talking about paying 450, 500 or something for this microspace as an
that's
alternative
exactly right.
to maybe, 2000 or 3000 for a studio.
Yeah, the average studio here is around, to your point, 2200. It's pretty
Right.
crazy.
Okay. That makes sense. And yeah, so that's interesting. So, you could take your rent from something somewhere near, 30K a year for a standard, studio apartment or something to uh, you know, it sounded like what do we say, 6 or 8 thousand per year?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's meaningful. That's, um that'll give you some runway for sure if that's your biggest expense. And how are people, how are they operating in these things? They mainly just sleep in them and then they spend the day elsewhere. How big is, like, looking at the room like behind you right now, like how big is 35 square units if you could try to like give or square feet if you try to give someone a sort of a sense?
Yeah, so imagine 5 feet. So for most males, you could probably reach out with both your hands, and it'll be slightly longer than 5 feet, and then so it's 5 feet wide by 7 feet deep. So it's literally just enough to just have a desk and like a rollout pad essentially for those units.
Yeah. Does a twin bed fit in there or not even?
Not even. Yeah, right now it's purely Japanese style where there's like a rollout mat that you use. It's almost like a yoga mat.
Got it. Interesting. And did you come across that size as being ideal? Was that like the property you were dealing with was already that size, or did you come across that size for some certain rationale?
Yeah, I primarily just wanted to stress test the market and work backwards to see what the market would bear as
Right.
far as size. Um, yeah, we started off around 35 square feet, and then we have the other units that are up to 60 to 70, slightly larger. But yeah,
Yeah.
the initial rationale was just to stress test it and see if users would pay for such a space.
Right. And 60 or 70 fits a twin?
Yeah, yeah, the
Yeah.
twin should be fine in there. Yeah.
Okay. And then so how do these people like live? Like, or you lived in one for a while, so you maybe can speak from experience. Like you're sleeping there. Are you also working there? Are you going to a cafe or something? Are you eating in there? Like what are you doing there besides just sleeping? And like how is that lifestyle for you? Because obviously, you're saving a lot, but there are a lot of things you can do in a studio that you can't do in a room that's not big enough to fit a twin. So I'm just curious. It makes sense that you wanted to test it and start at the extreme because otherwise you could have assumed this was the smallest you could do, but in fact you could have gone smaller. So it totally makes sense as a starting point. But to me, it's that sounds really small. So I'm just wondering like how life is like in that thing and where like the sweet spot might be.
Yeah, I view life in that thing as it's your last resort before sleeping in a car, essentially. So for me, my lifestyle experience there was I would wake up, I would work out, shower at the gym, I would work at a Starbucks pretty much all day. And then I would only come back and use that space when I'm ready to go to bed, essentially. To your point, I maybe do some work there. We had a little co-working area in that space as well with like a little coffee, kind of like a break room type of thing too. But I pretty much spent the entire day at like a Starbucks, and I would just come home and work, do maybe a couple hours of work, and go to bed. So it definitely wasn't the type of space where you would hang out in all day. It was just kind of I'm only there because I need somewhere to sleep,
Right.
essentially.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially like, it seems like it would lead towards a lifestyle where you're more dynamic, you're moving around more, you're checking out different places, utilizing like sort of
Yeah.
public spaces, and there's plenty of public spaces. So it's not really a huge issue. And then it's also it seems like it would lend itself towards a life of just like you're probably moving around more, you're walking around, you're spending more time outside. So from that perspective, it seems like sort of a healthy dynamic. But you've had people now who have lived there for, some number of months. Are these people who are like, staying there and then looking to move on up to something else, or are they content with that lifestyle for a while?
Yeah, I surely hope they're using it to move upwards. That's definitely the point. I guess we'll have to see what the behavior looks like over time. Yeah, most of them are just kind of using it as transitionary housing right now. The longest person we've had in there so far has been about 6 or 7 months. So we'll see how long they stay in there. But yeah, we told them from day one, this is meant to move on, like
Right.
get you to move forward, rather than being like a permanent place. But so far nobody's left. So I think that'll be an interesting data point for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious to see like sort of the longevity of it and whether there is some sort of in between option that is actually more desirable to people as a
Yeah.
fixed situation, where it's comfortable, but it doesn't necessarily need to be as large as, most of our default studios, one bedrooms, etc. So anyway, that's a really interesting sort of wrinkle in things. But getting back to like the core project with Theo, you've got, you guys are buying, you guys are having people mint Theo, using that capital, basically taking in Ethereum or maybe USDC or whatever,
Mhm.
and going and using that to buy microspaces as well as land, as well as individual units for rent. Um, what's like been the early traction so far? You've got people paying citizenship fees. You've got at least one rental property, it sounds like, with a guy renting. What are like sort of help like, illustrate kind of like the numbers around things? And I know you guys have had like tremendous demand for these early sort of like blocks of citizens that you've opened up. So maybe you could talk a little bit through that.
Yeah. So we with the capital that we raised from the community back in 2022, we did a case study with one condo so far, and we just wanted to see what that behavior would look like from the user perspective. Are they willing to buy a token and burn it? Um, so yeah, we were just kind of monitoring behavior there. I donated a couple of plots of land to the protocol as well to kind of gauge user demand too. And now we're actually at a point where we're going to open what we call growth markets, which will allow people to mint Theo and actually now start putting money into the treasury. So that's going to be actually the next set of rollouts that we'll have probably in the next couple of months, which is going to be the growth markets open where people can actually start minting Theo and start contributing towards that housing. But as far as the land that we have now, we have one plot of land, we have one case study condo, and then we have those 6 microspaces so far that we just kind of bootstrapped with our personal capital.
Right. And you guys are bringing in like there's a limited supply of these citizenships that can be, paid for each time. I think you did 20 at a time, and the last time you did it, it sold
Mhm.
out in like a minute.
Yeah.
What's the reasoning for like limiting that to the point where it is selling out in a minute? Would it be better to have 100, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, we plan on doubling it every single week, and we'll see where that leads up to a total of 10,000 initial users. But yeah, they simply pay $20 a month. We take about 15 of those bucks and we airdrop them the tokens back. So it's kind of like a mini dollar cost average in a way. And they also become actual owners of the real estate as well. So there's no, you know, company that Mel owns, that's the single entity owner of this real estate. It'll be actually divided amongst all these citizens that are paying a kind of like a mini tax, if you will, of $19 a month. So it's kind of like the basic concept is that the citizens own the land and the real estate of the network. Um, and yeah, right now we sold out our first 30 spots. We're going to release another 40 next week, and we'll keep doubling that. Um, Ideally, until we hit 10,000 is the goal. So a doubling of every week until we hit 10,000.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, the doubling, obviously it'll happen pretty quickly. If you keep doubling and the demand stays to being what it is, and continues to scale. And so there's two elements of, at least two, that I could think of, like elements of being an owner in that network. One is that you basically are owning a share of the rental income that's coming in through the properties owned by the network. And secondarily, you have access to various like public spaces that are owned by the network, or land. And my understanding is actually you can go with the current citizens. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like with that land that you have in Colorado, they're actually like entitled to a piece of that land that they can do whatever they want with. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, $19 a month, they get access to 5,000 square feet of raw land near fresh water. We're going to just acquire plots throughout the United States. Um, and then they'll get that quarterly airdrop as well of any excess proceeds just kind of go back to the users.
Has anyone done anything with the land thus far? It's still super early, so I imagine maybe not, but do you have, inklings from people of wanting to take advantage of their plot, or, build drive their car out there and hang out there for a while, or do something kind of interesting?
Yeah, we had a couple of guys inquire about a weed farm. So yeah, nobody's built anything quite yet. A couple of people have asked if they could go out there and camp and do do other activities. We just did it about 3 or 4 months ago, and we have a limited set of users. But I am deeply curious to see what that'll look like at a larger scale if people actually start um, coming together and building it. And the way we'll kind of do governance around that plot of land is we'll just let the citizens lead it completely. We're not going to impose any sort of governance on it. So we'll just kind of see what happens organically with like kind of like a self-organizing feature. We'll guide it, but we'll see where that kind of ended up landing.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of these successful projects, Bitcoin included, starts with a lot of people doing illegal stuff. And then, so like the weed thing doesn't surprise me at all, although that's not even illegal, I guess, in Colorado these days. So it's just, borderline, I guess, but not surprising. But on that subject, it's, I know like working with biology, one of the most important things from his perspective, which I share, is that, the quality of the early community is extremely important for sort of developing the culture and sort of ethos of a community, or, maybe eventually like a network state or
Yeah.
something in between. Are you doing anything to sort of like, do you have criteria or anything by which you're sort of filtering these people who within a minute are claiming these citizenships, or is it just sort of like, the project itself is putting out a magnet that you believe is attracting kind of the right types of people?
Yeah, that's exactly the goal. The mission is a network state based on personal excellence, and freezing the rents is kind of a core part of that. And I think anybody can participate in kind of the ethos behind that. Um, yeah, that's absolutely the goal is to build an incredibly deep community and then transition into a full blown kind of self-governing network state of sorts as well. And I think as AI and software deflation continues expanding, I'd be curious to see the need for affordable housing. I'm assuming it'll be correlated between the two. Like as software deflation AI expands, the need for affordable housing also expands with that as well. So I think this type of ethos should be pretty wide reaching overall as well.
And I don't know if you've had to deal with this so far. It's fairly limited number of citizens so far, but um, taking a long-term view, if someone's paying the $20 a month, and after a year or two decide like they're not really interested anymore, and they want to like sort of churn as a citizen, like what do they
Mhm.
lose and what do they keep?
Yeah, so they would lose access to that the way the product sits right now is they would lose access to their 5,000 plot just because we're charging them to simply maintain the property taxes and those elements as well. We'll have a feature where they can just take their plot with them, some sort of buyout mechanism that they
Yeah.
can implement. Um, but yeah, as of right now, the churn hasn't been too high, maybe like 3%. But of course, we don't have a ton of users in quite
Right.
yet, so it'll be interesting kind of seeing where that goes. Ideally, it's a simple split where they can just do like some sort of buyout and they get to keep their section if they wanted to.
And besides the access to the to the property, or to the rental income, do they keep their like Theo tokens that they've accrued over time and everything like that? And so they can
Yeah,
actually, even if they lose their access to the land, they could actually still own a piece of the network that they've sort of accrued, like you said, like sort of dollar cost averaging in over time.
exactly. Yep, they get to keep that. We don't lock it or anything like that, so they can just do whatever they want with that anytime they receive their Theo.
All right. Well, sounds really interesting. I'm down. I'm down to become a citizen. I don't know when the next thing opens up, or I guess it's gonna be 40. And I might have to like sit by the computer to get there in under a minute or whatever. But I'm down to do it. It sounds super interesting. I don't know. Did you come across the There's been a few projects in the space, obviously. Did you come across what was it called, City DAO at all with the Wyoming plot? Was that interesting
I
at all,
did.
or?
Yeah, we actually just reached out to them. I believe they're actually unwinding right now. We're in the process of connecting with them, trying to see how we could help them. I think the challenge of going for purely raw land, which some projects have done, where they buy like an island or some just like a pure raw land project, I think it's difficult because development is a total bitch. I mean, it's so hard to develop anything, right? You have to get approvals. It's super cost intensive.
Yeah.
The attention span of crypto these days is hard to maintain. Anything past 10 seconds. So I think the raw land thesis for network states will be interesting to watch. I'm slightly bearish on it because I think it's just so hard to organize around that. But if anybody pulls it off, I'd be curious to see where that goes. I think you'll need multiple elements to be successful in a network state domain. But of course, crazy things can happen. I'd be curious to see how that pans out if anybody's truly successful, just purely raw land. I think that'll be interesting.
Yeah, it's cool. I bring it up because it was kind of the first project that I saw that was really interesting that, I had like a citizenship NFT or whatever at the
Mm,
time. And I'm not the type of guy I'm not out there buying like tons of different NFTs or whatever. Like it's my threshold for interest within crypto is I would say pretty high. It's not like a, black and white
yeah.
threshold. The threshold is different for everyone, obviously. There's different things that are interesting, but for me, one of the categories of things that's very interesting is this category that we're talking about. And
Mhm.
so when like CityDAO came out, I was like, oh man, like I don't really care what's going on here. Like that's interesting. Like I'm in. And this is like striking a similar chord. And if there's other projects that are similar, I'll probably be similarly interested. So yeah, it's cool to see, evolutions of these sorts of ambitious products come along. Um, and yeah, I guess so. Anything else you want to say on the project? Maybe we can wrap that up. I know we're coming up on time, and then I have one more question for you, unrelated to Theo. But did we miss anything? Is there anything that we should mention before we tie that up?
Yeah. I always like leaving any, I guess, any public facing. I tell the community this all the time. It's always good to just do your own research. Anybody, I guess, anybody listening, if they're new or whatever the case is as well, always do your own research. Ask questions, poke holes, and take your time. I guess. I guess that'd be my final statement. I definitely didn't want to make this into like a show for Theo or anything like
No,
that. But
no.
yeah, just do your own research. Hop into the Discord if anybody has any questions. Ask anytime. We're always available. The core team is, and we're always happy to chat as well.
Sweet. So my last question is around this interesting thing that I've seen you write about, which is this like live streaming world record that you're after. And I saw like I think it was yesterday you posted, or as of the time of recording, you posted a 5+ hour stream. And you're basically it's like to paint people a picture, it's like they can see your screen, like it's a full screen share, plus, a little window that shows you actually, like sitting at the desk doing the work or whatever it is that you're doing. What's going on there? It sounds really interesting, and you've got, ambitions for a live streaming world record, I understand.
Yes. Yeah, it's just another point of the effort of just trying to bootstrap an organic community. I've tried to do everything I possibly could to bring in eyeballs to the project. So I changed my legal name to Nobody Special, just because the legal docs would just be kind of funny as we build that out.
Wow.
We're going for a world record for live streaming pretty soon. We're kind of ramping up towards it right now. My personal wallet of all my Theo will be reserved for just giveaways to people watching the live stream and the citizens as well. So my Theo is going to just be donated back to citizens as well to kind of bootstrap that organic behavior. Yeah, I wanted to see what kind of world record we could attempt, and my parameter was really tight. It was like, how do I go for a world record by sitting in a computer chair? And that was the only one that we could find. So the right now the world record is around 26 days. By some guy in China that achieved it. So we're talking to the consultants from Guinness right now, and it would just be kind of like a funny headline, just nobody special and then like a world record. It'd just be kind of funny, maybe a funny meme.
Yeah,
So
no,
we'll see
I
where that
love
goes.
it. I love it. And it's 26 days. I didn't realize, I didn't know if the live streaming world record was like a cumulative thing or one sitting. Is that 26 days of a guy going straight and recording 26? Like, is he sleeping? Like, what's going on there?
I think so. I'm going to talk to the consultants from Guinness, and they'll give me a better kind of parameter rules on it. But I think it's literally on camera 24/7 for 26 days. Like you're sleeping there, you're doing everything there. So it'll be interesting.
Interesting. Well, 5 hours, you're on your way. You've got a ways to go, but it's a pretty good start. I feel like, I mean, is there things that you've noticed that have been surprising? Like the one thing that's, or not the one thing, but one thing that is interesting is it's sort of like this default public situation where you're just default sharing everything, your
Mm,
screen and people being able to see you. And there was like some experiments with like the founders of Twitch, like Justin Khan started with like Justin TV, where he like strapped the GoPro to his head, or I don't know exactly even how he did it, but he's like sort of streaming himself all the time. And I think it's a really interesting thing to lean in on. Like for me, when I started like podcasting, I sort of started to question this, the default call is not recorded and private and not
mm,
shared. And I think that a ton of calls, if you sort of like question that default and you just had every call that you do or every conversation you have, um, you made an active decision on should this be private or should this be public. There's tons of conversations that have no real need to be private. And the thought is like, well, if it's public, no one's gonna be interested. But I think one thing that we kind of see with the internet is like there's someone out there who's kind of interested in everything almost. Like I think it's just because the balance of producers and consumers is so out of whack and there's so few people relatively producing and so many people consuming that at this point in time, if you kind of produce anything, like you will probably get someone consuming at least with as much time as you spent producing, in a sense.
yeah.
And so you're sort of going for this default public mode. But one thing you're doing is like, it's not just people being able to look at you while you work, which I think that was like I don't know if it's like a TikTok fad or something. I heard of like people doing these like long YouTube videos where it's just like, I'm going to do some work and you turn on
Yeah.
the video of me doing the work and you work with me or whatever. And they went like super popular. Um, but this is actually like you're sharing your screen too. And there's like a lot of things there that actually probably should be private or need to be private in some cases for like legal reasons or whatever. So if you had to like navigate any issues with that or, any sort of unexpected challenges in the early stages of going for this live streaming world record?
Yeah, that's a great point. We're still navigating through that. I view everything, especially being a US based project. I work at the default by the default of everything will be open sourced anyway, or it will be public anyway. Just because if the SEC does their job, they'll probably poke into everything anyway.
Yeah.
So it's just a really good kind of hygienic way of operating in my eyes. Where if you just go purely public on, it's a hygienic way to do business, I think. And to your point, it actually surprised me, even the limited live streams I've had, where I'm just stumbling trying to get the audio right. There was like a few people listening,
Yeah.
so it's intriguing. I'm curious to see how far this experiment can go, where it's a public project, public live stream, and there's public a way to publicly organize financially around it as well. I think it'll be an interesting experiment for the space, and I'm happy to test it out and see where it goes.
Awesome. Well, appreciate all this. It's been a really interesting conversation. I know I'm interested in this public, you know, going to default public with most things, but it sort of comes at odds with the whole pseudonymity thing. So it's like a little bit challenging to navigate that situation, but it's definitely intriguing. And certainly the project with Theo is super intriguing. So excited to hopefully get involved there. And so you said the legal name now is in fact Nobody Special.
That is a legal name, yes.
Awesome. Well, if it's cool with you, I think we'll do this. We'll post the podcast as Nobody Special. We'll stick with the legal name and see where that goes.
Sounds good. Awesome.